started looking at the first few verses of James. For those of you who may not know, we started the book of James. So we're going to go through that passage by passage and cover the entire book. Hopefully by, I don't know, same time next year, we're going to finish. Maybe. And what we found out 2 weeks ago, in just the first few verses, we learned about how to handle within ourselves the trials and tests of our lives. Remember, it says we are to count it as pure joy when we encounter trials of different kinds. And that's mainly because our trials and suffering that comes from our trials are being used to develop our character and make us more mature followers of Christ. But the topic of how to handle trials didn't stop there. In James chapter 1, the topic of handling trials actually begins starting the first few verses of James, and then it extends all the way up to verse 12, where it says in verse 12, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life." So the verses that we have today in our scripture reading, these are part of the middle verses, and that's verses 5 to 8. It actually still dwells on the topic of how to handle trials and troubles. But now it is approaching it from a different angle, a totally different perspective. So again, 2 weeks ago we said we ought to consider it pure joy to go through our trials because God uses our trials to shape our character so that we would be complete and lacking in nothing. Now, I know there are many Christians who find that encouraging. That means, our trials, our tests, they all serve a purpose. As much as we don't want to go through a trial or test, God assures us that this will ultimately benefit us. But I can also understand if there are other Christians who may not find much encouragement in that. For example, once in a while I do get some sermon feedback, either volunteered or not. After the sermon 2 weeks ago on finding joy in our trials, I had a person ask me, and I won't mention who, a person said, "So, where is the joy? I'm still waiting on the joy that I'm supposed to get through my trials and troubles." I mean, do you guys feel that sometimes? Maybe not. Now, I think the question was asked of me partly, of course, to give me a hard time. That's one. Because I know that the person who asked me knows that God is using our suffering for our ultimate benefit when all is said and done. But to this person, and I think maybe to a lot of other Christians, there's a part of us, inside of us, that may be asking, where is the joy in that? All this trial and suffering for a change in our character. Is there much more to it than that? Or is that it? I think our scripture for today, in a sense, can help with that. Our reading today continues on the topic of handling trials and suffering, but approaches it mainly through the eyes of wisdom and prayer and faith. What our scripture today is saying is that if any of us lack wisdom, especially when we get to our trials and troubles, the main thing we need is wisdom. And it also explains to us how we can get this wisdom. In general, in the New Testament, wisdom is about understanding God's purpose and plan and being able to live according to God's plan and purpose. So in other words, the first thing you need when you fall into trials, one of the first things is to ask yourself, do you have wisdom? Do I have wisdom in this matter? Nowadays, that's not what people really ask. Normally, when someone falls into trials, we want to find a quick solution. We want to know all the information we need to know. When we're hit with trouble in the area of finances or our marriage or relationships, We want to know all the steps we need to take, what methods or techniques to do. And I'm not saying that all those are necessarily bad things, but our scripture today says that what we need is wisdom. Why do we need this? And how do we get it? At this point, I need to acknowledge Pastor Tim Keller for some of the parts of the material that I'm about to explain. It's good material. So when I see something like this from other preachers and their explanation that are, way much smarter than what I can come up with, I have no problem sharing them if I think it will help edify the church. So the question is, why do we need wisdom, especially in times of trials? 2 weeks ago, I mentioned that in times of trials and troubles, we normally do a fight or flight response. So we either run away or we fight. That means we either want to control the situation or we want to get rid of it entirely. And those two responses, they're all like, instinct to us. When a terrible thing happens to us, it feels bad. It feels terrible. None of us, if we're honest, want to ever go through life dealing with a lot of bad things. But what makes terrible events really troubling is, to a big extent, not the event itself, but what we tell ourselves about the event. Just to be clear, there is the event, whatever trial that happened, that's an event. And then there's our interpretation of the event. There is what happened, and there is the story of what we think happened. There is a certain wisdom through which we see or interpret events. So the actual event itself and how we see the event based on our own wisdom and our own understanding, these are, a lot of times these could be two different things. And what causes us more trouble is our interpretation of the event. For example, there is this kind of an average hotel, that offers a room to many kinds of guests. Think about an average hotel. I don't know, for you, an average hotel is like a Motel 6 or a Best Western. I don't know if that's the case. A newlywed couple comes one day and asks if they can check out one of the rooms. Since the hotel is quite average, the couple takes one look at the room and says, "Ugh, it's not a good room for our honeymoon. This wouldn't cut it. We don't want to stay. We don't want to stay here." After they left, the hotel then offers the same room to a man who was just released from prison. On seeing the room, the man said, "Wow, I like it here. Yeah, this is paradise compared to the prison I just came from." In that example, it's the same average room that is offered, but it is perceived from a different perspective and from different expectations of what the person wants or deserve, think they deserve. It's the same event, different interpretation or story about what that event means. All this, this isn't saying that troubling events like sickness or relationship loss or financial loss, this is not to say that those aren't bad things. Troubling events are bad in and of themselves. So this isn't about promoting positive thinking. This is just to say that our troubles and sufferings, because of our trials, are also greatly influenced by the wisdom with which we experience the trials. I think you all may know of people who experience problems and trouble, and these people, when that happens to them, they crash and burn. Their lives seem done and over. And I think you may also know people who experience trials and sufferings, but are able to handle it differently, with grace and wisdom. So to a certain extent, it's not really about the event of the trial or the suffering itself, but it is about the wisdom through which we can see our trials. It is about whether we can face it with what we believe about God and what God has done for us. Wisdom, part of what wisdom is about perceiving what the world calls misfortune as an opportunity for God to bring about God's purpose. So when the Bible talks about wisdom, it is not talking about the worldly kind of wisdom. There is a wisdom in the world that continues to be promoted continuously, but it is actually some kind of a false wisdom. It is something we may not even notice, but it's in the air. It's everywhere. It's all around us and can actually influence us. And when it does, it actually affects our interpretation of events, such as events of our trial and suffering. Now, before I talk more about God's wisdom, I will first talk about just 3 examples of worldly wisdom in our day and age that makes a big difference on how we interpret events. The first example is a belief that comes from the advances that we have made in the age of technology. We are sort of in a high technological age, and with all the gains that the world has had in the area of technology, especially in the medical field, for example, people can go through and recover from a heart attack much easier than 20, 30 years ago, even 10 years ago. What is deemed as a hopeless heart attack decades ago can be treated with surgical precision as an outpatient procedure. I remember a particular event at a hospital where I worked as a chaplain many years ago. I was with his family and one of the adult children was seriously ill. But the father of the family told me they had the best surgeon in the hospital. The hospital had the best equipment. Hospital was also highly ranked, not just in California, but in the whole United States. So while I was visiting with the family member had a code blue. So the medical team came with their crash cart and to try to revive the patient. But the family, they didn't seem to be panicking. The father calmly kept explaining to all the members of his family, the medical procedure and the process that is happening in order that, their family member is going to be revived. I guess, the family members seemed very knowledgeable in terms of medicine and technology, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now, of course, maybe that's part of how he wants to cope with seeing his child being resuscitated. It must be the most difficult thing to see. Definitely, no doubt, your child in the process of dying is a very bad event, no matter what interpretation you put in it. But he was coping based on his knowledge of medical technology. As if maybe some people might think technology alone will save the day. Unfortunately, what advanced science and technology does is it makes us think that we are in charge. Sometimes we end up thinking that way, that we have the technology. We can solve anything. We can fix any problem. But no matter what gains we have in this area, eventually the death rate catches up on us. The death rate is 1 death for every person. No one escapes death. It catches up. In the end, we are not really in charge. But the world's wisdom can sometimes make us think that we are. Going back to my hospital story, while the patient was being resuscitated, unfortunately, he died. After the medical team stopped the procedure and noted the time of death, the father of the patient was still busy trying to figure out what went wrong with the technology. But this time he was also thinking about who was responsible for what. I don't know if he was doing this because he wanted to sue somebody. I never knew if he ended up doing that. But nowadays, even if a child is born with some kind of defect, parents are actually more inclined to sue someone in the hospital than they were many, many years ago. The thing is, as I've said, we're not really in charge, although technology invites us to think that we are. A second example of a belief or a false wisdom that affects us is the belief that we all deserve a great life. This is different from the abundant life that Jesus came to give us. Nowadays, people think that the universe owes us an amazing life. You know, the concept of sin doesn't really exist. So if a person is unforgiving and bitter, instead of forgiving, the person says that he or she is hurting, or he or she is broken, and he or she needs to be taken care of. Never mind that the person is causing his or her own brokenness because of a lack of forgiveness. It's like replacing the concept of sin, which we cannot deal by ourselves, in and of ourselves, replacing it with a medical model as a problem that can be fixed with a process or with medication. You find people doing, or can justify doing, illegal things, all kinds of illegal things, because they think they deserve better. There is a book by David Myers called The Pursuit of Happiness. In this book, he points out that increasing wealth does not in any way add to a person's self-perception of joy or happiness. In fact, the level of perceived joy is essentially the same, regardless of age, gender, race, education, location, or even the presence of some kind of tragic disability. So when people ask, why do bad things happen to good people? Behind that question is an expectation that we deserve a better life. Now, I don't think that's how James and the other apostles and disciples throughout the centuries thought about when they were being persecuted and martyred for their faith. So again, we have first a belief in technology, that we're in control. And then we have the belief that we deserve a better life. And the third example that I can give you is the belief of the secular world. The belief that you need to have all your happiness in this life, because that's pretty much it. When your life is over, you are done. This life is all that there is. So when you miss out on the best relationship, or the best job, or the best things, then your life sucks. Because this life is all there is, from a secular perspective. I mean, isn't that sort of the assumption behind making a bucket list, in a sense? If you Google bucket list in the internet, you can find many suggestions, 100 things, 1,000 things, of things you can do before you die, places you need to go, famous people you need to meet, things you need to do, and so on and so forth. Before you die, you ought to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, if that's how to pronounce it, or walk the Golden State Bridge. I'm not necessarily saying that a bucket